First exploration. What if the chains you wear were forged by your own consent? There's a sentence written in 1762 that still burns quietly in the margins of history. And if you've never heard it spoken aloud in the dark, maybe tonight is the night it finds you. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a man who spent his life unraveling the knots of civilization, once wrote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." But here's the part that stays with you long after the page is turned. He wasn't talking about kings or conquerors. He was talking about you, about the quiet compromises you made without even knowing you were making them, about the invisible architecture of your own captivity. Picture a man alone in a candlelit room, bent over parchment, his hand trembling not from cold, but from the weight of what he's about to say. Rousseau wasn't a revolutionary in the loud sense. He didn't storm palaces or raise armies. He did something far more dangerous. He asked a question so simple it shattered the foundations of every government, every institution, every unspoken agreement that held society together. He asked, "Why do we obey?" Not out of fear, not out of force, but willingly, eagerly even. What makes a man bow his head to a system he never chose and call it freedom? The answer he found is almost unbearable in its intimacy. We obey because we believe we agreed to it. Somewhere, somehow, in a contract we never signed, we gave away our wildness, our sovereignty, our original selves, in exchange for safety, order, belonging. Rousseau called it the social contract. But what he really meant was this: you traded the forest for the city, and now you can't remember what the trees sounded like at night. Think about the life you live, the alarm that wakes you, the routes you take without thinking, the roles you perform so smoothly you forget their performances. Citizen, employee, neighbor, father, brother, son. These aren't just titles. They're agreements, invisible signatures on a document written long before you were born. And the most unsettling part? You enforce them yourself. You don't need a guard at your door, because you've become your own guard. The chains aren't made of iron. They're made of habit, expectation, the fear of what happens if you step outside the lines. Rousseau saw this with a clarity that made him unbearable to be around. He was the kind of man who couldn't sit at a dinner party without wondering why everyone was pretending, why the laughter felt rehearsed, why no one said what they actually meant. He watched people bow to customs they despised, and he couldn't understand it. Or maybe he understood it too well, and that's what broke him. He spent years wandering, exiled, paranoid, convinced the world was conspiring against him, but maybe he was just the only one awake in a room full of sleepers. Here's the part that lingers. Rousseau didn't offer an easy escape. He didn't say you could shrug off society and return to some imagined Eden. He knew that door was closed. Once you've tasted language, law, love, once you've felt the warmth of a shared fire, you can't unknow it. The chains are real, but so is the consent. And that's where the quiet power lives. Because if you agreed to this, even unknowingly, then maybe, just maybe, you can choose differently. Not by running away, but by waking up inside the life you're already living and asking for the first time in a long time, what here is truly mine. Rousseau believed that true freedom wasn't the absence of constraint. It was the presence of will. It was the difference between being told what to do and choosing what to become. And the only way to find that will was to stop, really stop, and listen to the voice beneath the noise, the one that remembers what it felt like before you learned to obey. So tonight, As the room grows quiet and the day's demands fade into the background, let that question sit with you. Not as a problem to solve, but as a companion in the dark. What if the life you think you're living is just the shape of an agreement you never questioned? And what if, in this stillness, you could hear the faint sound of your own consent being withdrawn, one breath at a time, until all that's left is the truth of who you were before the world told you who to be? Rousseau didn't have all the answers. He died alone, bitter, misunderstood. But he left behind a whisper that refuses to fade. You are more free than you remember, and more bound than you know. The question isn't whether the chains exist. It's whether you'll ever stop long enough to feel their weight and decide, in the deep silence of your own heart, if they're worth keeping. But before we leave this thought behind, there's one more silence worth listening to. Second exploration. What did Rousseau see in civilization that made him weep? There's a moment in every man's life when he looks around and realizes the world he thought he understood is actually a stage, and everyone, including him, is performing. Rousseau had that moment early, and it never left him. He looked at the glittering courts of Europe, the powdered wigs, the polished manners, the symphonies and salons, and he didn't see progress. He saw a tragedy, a slow, beautiful forgetting. Civilization, he believed, hadn't elevated humanity. It had buried it under layers of pretense so thick that people could no longer recognize their own faces. Imagine walking into a grand hall, chandeliers blazing, voices rising in cultured laughter. Everyone is dressed immaculately. Everyone knows their place. And yet, beneath the surface, there's a quiet violence, a performance of superiority, a calculus of status, 1,000 invisible judgments happening behind every smile. Rousseau stood in rooms like that and felt something close to nausea. Not because he hated beauty or refinement, but because he saw what it cost. The smoothness, the constant self-editing, the way people had learned to hide their true selves so well. They forgot they were hiding at all. He once wrote an essay that scandalized all of Europe. It was called Discourse on the Sciences and Arts, and in it, he argued something almost heretical, that progress was a lie, that all the advancements of civilization, the art, the philosophy, the technology, hadn't made people happier or more virtuous. If anything, they'd made them smaller, more vain, more disconnected from the raw, unfiltered aliveness that existed before society taught them shame. He wasn't saying we should go back to living in caves. He was saying we'd lost something essential in the climb toward refinement. Something wild, honest, and irreplaceable. Rousseau looked at a child and saw freedom. Not because children are better or wiser, but because they haven't yet learned to lie about who they are. They cry when they're sad. They laugh when they're delighted. They don't perform kindness. They feel it, or they don't. And then, slowly, inevitably, civilization begins its work. The child learns to say please and thank you, even when they mean nothing. They learn to smile at people they distrust. They learn that their natural impulses are wrong, dangerous, embarrassing. They learn to wear a mask so well that eventually they forget it's a mask at all. This was Rousseau's grief. Not that civilization existed, but that it demanded this sacrifice and called it growing up. He believed that somewhere in the long march from tribes to empires, humanity had made a terrible trade. We gave up authenticity for acceptance, wildness for belonging, the self for the role. And now, centuries later, we're so tangled in the performance that we can't tell where the costume ends and the person begins. You've felt this, haven't you? The moments when you catch yourself saying what you're supposed to say instead of what you actually think. The way you smooth over discomfort, avoid conflict, keep the peace. Even when the peace is a lie. The way you've learned to be pleasant, professional, appropriate. And somewhere, deep down, there's a voice that wonders, when was the last time I said something true? Rousseau wept because he saw a world full of people who'd forgotten how to be alone with themselves, who needed constant distraction, constant validation, constant proof that they were playing the role correctly. He saw luxury and called it loneliness. He saw sophistication and called it fear. He wasn't against society. He was against what society had done to the soul, the way it turned people into echoes of each other, polished and smooth, and utterly terrifyingly empty. But here's the part he never quite said aloud, the part that only emerges in the quiet after the words stop. Maybe the tragedy isn't that we wear masks. Maybe it's that we've forgotten we're wearing them. And maybe, just maybe, the first step back towards something real isn't tearing everything down. It's just sitting still long enough to feel the weight of the disguise. To notice the places where you tighten, where you perform, where you bend yourself into shapes that don't quite fit. Rousseau died believing he'd failed, that no one understood him, that the world would go on pretending forever. But his words didn't die. They slipped into the cracks, into the quiet moments when someone stops and wonders, is this really it? And in those moments, something shifts. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough to remember, just for a breath, what it felt like before you learned to hide. And with that memory still glowing faintly in the dark, there's one last question waiting. Third exploration. Can a man be good in a world that rewards corruption? Rousseau spent most of his life trying to answer a question that still haunts anyone who's ever tried to live with integrity. Is it even possible? Not in theory. Not in some idealized version of the world. But here. Now. In the messy, compromised, deeply flawed reality we actually inhabit. Can a man be good when the system itself is designed to reward those who aren't? When honesty is punished and cunning is celebrated? When the people who climb highest are often the ones who cared least about who they stepped on along the way? Rousseau believed humanity was born good, not perfect, not angelic, but naturally inclined toward compassion, cooperation, a kind of quiet decency. He called it natural goodness, the idea that before society twisted us into competitors and performers, we were simply kind. We helped because it felt right. We shared because we had enough. We cared for one another not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, something instinctual. A child doesn't need to be taught to cry when another child is hurt. That empathy is already there, woven into the fabric of being human. But then something changed. Society emerged. Property, status, comparison. Suddenly, there was a winner and a loser, a have and a have-not. And with that division came something Rousseau saw as the original corruption. Amour propre. Not self-love, but the need to be better than, to be admired, to be envied. It's the voice that whispers, you're only worth what others think you're worth. And once that voice takes root, everything shifts. Kindness becomes strategy. Generosity becomes performance. Even love gets tangled in the calculus of how it looks to the outside world. Rousseau watched this poison spread through every layer of society. He saw politicians who spoke of justice while hoarding power, philosophers who preached virtue while betraying their friends, artists who created beauty and used it as currency for fame. And the worst part? It worked. The corrupt thrived. The honest starved. The man who refused to play the game was cast out, mocked, forgotten. Rousseau knew this firsthand. He tried to live by his principles, refusing patronage, speaking uncomfortable truths, walking away from wealth and influence when it came with strings attached. And it destroyed him. He ended his life poor, paranoid, convinced the world had conspired to break him. Maybe it had. So what's a man supposed to do? That's the question that keeps you awake at 3 a.m, isn't it? You see the compromises everywhere. The colleague who takes credit for your work and gets promoted. The friend who lies smoothly, and everyone loves him for it. The politician who says one thing and does another, and half the country cheers. You watch people bend the rules, cut corners, sell out their values, and win. And you wonder, quietly, bitterly, am I the fool for trying to stay honest? Rousseau didn't have a clean answer. He couldn't tell you how to be good in a corrupt world without suffering for it. What he could tell you, though, is this: the suffering means something. It's not wasted. Because every time you choose integrity when it costs you, every time you tell the truth when a lie be easier, every time you walk away from something profitable because it doesn't feel right, you're doing something the corrupt can never do. You're keeping faith with yourself. And that faith, that unbroken thread between who you are and who you claim to be, is the only thing the world can't take from you. Rousseau believed that corruption wins in the short term, but destroys in the long term. Not always visibly, not always dramatically, but slowly, inevitably. The man who lives by cunning becomes hollow. He succeeds, but he doesn't know who he is anymore. He's rich, admired, powerful, and utterly alone in the only way that matters, because he's lost the one relationship that can't be faked, the one with himself. You've seen it. The man who has everything and trusts no one. The man who climbed so high he forgot what ground felt like. The man who won the game, but lost the ability to feel anything real. Rousseau saw that man everywhere he looked, and he pitied him. Not because he'd failed, but because he'd succeeded at the wrong thing. So maybe the question isn't whether you can be good in a corrupt world. Maybe it's whether you can live with yourself if you're not. Whether you're willing to lose a little, sacrifice a little, be misunderstood a little, in exchange for the quiet, unshakable knowledge that you didn't betray who you are. Rousseau paid a heavy price for that knowledge. But in his final days, wandering alone by a lake, he found something the powerful never do: peace. Not the peace of victory, but the peace of alignment. The peace of a man who, however broken, however battered, still recognized his own reflection. And maybe that's all any of us can hope for. Not to win, not to be celebrated, but to reach the end of the road and know, without question, that the person who started the journey and the person who finished it are still, somehow, miraculously, the same. The room is quiet now. Rousseau's voice fades into the dark, but the questions remain, not demanding answers, just resting there, like old companions who've walked with you longer than you realized. Fourth exploration. Was there ever a time when your heart was not for sale? There was a man once who walked into the glittering salons of Paris and felt only disgust. Jean-Jacques Rousseau stood among powdered wigs and silk waistcoats, watching men perform their personalities like trained actors. and something inside him recoiled, not with anger exactly, with grief, because he understood what no one else seemed willing to admit, that somewhere along the way humanity had traded its soul for applause. Picture him there, awkward and out of place, his clothes too plain, his manner too honest. The room buzzes with wit and charm, but every word feels rehearsed, every laugh calculated. Men speak not to communicate, but to impress. Women smile not from joy, but from strategy. And Rousseau sees it all with terrible clarity. This is not society. This is theater, and everyone has forgotten their acting. He would later write that man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. But what haunted him most wasn't the chains themselves. It was how desperately people clung to them, how they decorated their bondage with jewels and called it civilization, how they measured their worth by the admiration of strangers and never stopped to ask what they'd surrendered to earn it. Think about your own life for a moment, not in judgment, just in quiet observation. How much of what you do each day is truly yours? How many of your desires were planted there by someone selling something? How often do you speak your actual thoughts versus the thoughts you believe will be well received? Rousseau would say that modern man has become so alienated from himself, he no longer knows where his authentic self ends and his performance begins. He saw this with piercing precision in 18th century France. But the truth metastasizes in every age. We are living in an era where your attention is a commodity traded on markets you'll never see, where algorithms know your desires before you feel them, where every corner of existence has been monetized, optimized, and sold back to you as an upgrade to a life you didn't realize you'd lost. Rousseau believed there was a time, perhaps mythical, perhaps historical, when humans lived in a more natural state. Not noble savages in some romantic wilderness, but simply people whose needs were simple and whose hearts were their own. A man felt hunger and sought food. He felt affection and expressed it without calculation. His sense of self came from within, not from the reflection in another's eyes. But then, something shifted. Men began to gather, to compare, to compete. And in that comparison, a poison entered the human spirit. Rousseau called it amour propre, a kind of self-love that depends entirely on others. It's not the quiet self-respect of someone who knows their own worth. It's the desperate need to be seen, to be admired, to rank higher in an invisible hierarchy that consumes every waking thought. You see it everywhere now, in the way people curate their lives for invisible audiences, in the gnawing anxiety that you're falling behind some race you never agreed to run, in the hollow ache that comes from achieving everything you were told to want and discovering it doesn't fill the space it promised to. Rousseau wasn't naive. He didn't believe we could return to some imagined Eden. But he insisted we face the truth of what we'd become, that we stop pretending our compromises are choices, that we acknowledge the price we pay for every comfort, every convenience, every gilded distraction that keeps us from asking the one question that matters. Who would I be if no one was watching? He walked through those Parisian salons and saw men who had become strangers to themselves, men who measured their worth in applause and died having never been known. And it broke his heart, because he understood that this wasn't just their tragedy, it was humanity's. We had built a world that required us to betray ourselves just to survive in it. The night is quiet now. The performances have ended. The masks are off, at least for a moment. And maybe in this stillness you can feel it. That small, persistent voice beneath all the noise, the part of you that has never been for sale, the part that remembers what it felt like before you learned to translate every feeling into currency. Rousseau spent his life trying to remind people that this voice still exists, that beneath the layers of social conditioning and manufactured desire, there remains something irreducibly you, something that can't be bought or sold or optimized away. But finding it requires a kind of courage most people never summon, the courage to stop performing and start listening. The world will always offer you a price for your authenticity. It will promise comfort, status, belonging, anything to keep you playing the game. But Rousseau would whisper this truth in your ear. The only thing that was ever truly yours is the one thing you keep trying to sell. But before we leave this thought behind, there's another confession Rousseau made, one that cuts even deeper. Fifth exploration. Did Rousseau destroy his own children? Because he saw what the world would do to them. Here's the thing they don't tell you in philosophy class. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the man who wrote the most influential book on education in Western history, gave away all 5 of his children to an orphanage. One by one, he and his companion Thérèse handed their infants over to foundling hospitals, where the mortality rate hovered near 90%. He knew this. He did it anyway. The hypocrisy is staggering, isn't it? The man who would pen Émile, teaching the world how to raise a child in harmony with nature, could not bear to raise his own. His critics called him a monster. His enemies used it to discredit everything he wrote. And Rousseau himself, in his final years, was tortured by the weight of what he'd done. But here's where the story gets strange and unbearably human. In his Confessions, Rousseau tries to explain himself. And what emerges isn't a justification. It's a window into a mind so alienated from the world that he believed the greatest act of love was abandonment. He looked at society, at its cruelty and corruption, and he made a calculation that still echoes through the centuries. Better they die innocent than live to become what this world makes of people. Think about that for a moment. Not whether it's right. It isn't. But what kind of despair leads a man to that conclusion? What does it mean when someone looks at civilization and sees only a machine for destroying souls? Rousseau lived in an age of astonishing brutality, masked by elegant manners. Children were property. Women had no voice. The poor existed to serve the rich, and everyone pretended this was natural order. He watched people bend and break under these systems, watched them internalize their own oppression until they couldn't imagine any other way to live. And he thought, I cannot save them from this, but maybe I can spare them from having to become it. There's something almost unbearably vulnerable in his reasoning. He wasn't a man of means. He lived hand to mouth, dependent on the patronage of aristocrats he despised. He was temperamentally unsuited for stability, prone to paranoia, to outbursts, to burning bridges with anyone who tried to help him. And he looked at this chaos he called a life and thought, what kind of father would I be? What kind of world would I bring them into? The tragedy is that he was probably right about himself. He would have been a terrible father, unstable, obsessive, lost in his own mind. But he was wrong about what that meant. Because in abandoning his children to avoid damaging them, he created a wound that bled through everything else he ever wrote. You can feel it in Émile. That book isn't just about education. It's an act of penance. It's Rousseau's attempt to be the father to an imaginary child that he couldn't be to his real ones. Every page drips with the tenderness of someone trying to redeem himself through fiction. He creates a perfect world where a boy can grow up unspoiled, where nature and reason guide him instead of society's corruption. It's beautiful. It's heartbreaking. And it's a fantasy written by a man haunted by what he threw away. But here's the question that keeps me awake. Was he entirely wrong? Not about abandoning his children, that's indefensible, but about the deeper intuition underneath it, that this world is hostile to innocence, that society is structured to break the parts of us that matter most, that maybe the kindest thing we can do is protect people from what we've become. You've felt this too, haven't you? That moment when you realize you're complicit in systems you despise, when you see yourself perpetuating the same patterns that damaged you, when you wonder if the best thing you could do for someone you love is keep them at a distance from the compromised person you've had to become to survive. Rousseau never recovered from his choice. It followed him like a shadow, darkening every triumph. He became paranoid in his later years, convinced the world was conspiring against him. And maybe it was. Or maybe the real conspiracy was internal, the way guilt can turn your own mind into an enemy. There's a portrait of him from those final years. He looks exhausted, not just tired, hollowed out. Like a man who's been arguing with himself for so long, he's forgotten which side he's on. And I think about what it must have been like to live inside that head, to be the prophet of authenticity, while knowing you betrayed the most authentic thing in human experience, the bond between parent and child. The world never forgave him for it. History hasn't either. But maybe that's the point. Maybe Rousseau is meant to stand as a warning, not just about hypocrisy, but about the cost of seeing too clearly, about what happens when you understand the world's cruelty so thoroughly that you start making impossible choices just to avoid participating in it. The night doesn't judge him. It just holds his story like it holds all our stories, the beautiful parts and the unforgivable parts, tangled together until you can't separate them anymore. And maybe that's closer to truth than any philosophy he ever wrote. But there's one more silence we need to sit with. One final question Rousseau left unanswered. Sixth exploration. What if the freedom you're chasing is just another name for loneliness? Rousseau spent his final years alone in a cottage, copying music for pennies. The great philosopher who had challenged empires and inspired revolutions died in obscurity, estranged from nearly everyone who'd ever known him. His paranoia had reached fever pitch. He believed his friends were plotting against him, that his mail was being intercepted, that the whole world had conspired to destroy him. Some of it was true. Most of it wasn't. But the isolation was absolute. And here's what haunts me about this ending. He chose it. Over and over, he chose it. Every time someone reached out, he pushed them away. Every friendship that threatened to tether him to the world, he severed. He said he was protecting his freedom, his authenticity, his right to live on his own terms. But what if what he was really doing was running? What if the freedom he preached was just elaborate justification for being unable to connect? This is the question no one wants to ask about Rousseau, because it implicates all of us. We live in a culture that worships independence, that tells you to find yourself, trust yourself, be true to yourself. And these aren't wrong, exactly, but they're dangerously incomplete. Because somewhere in the pursuit of authenticity, we've confused being free with being alone. Rousseau saw the corruption in social bonds, the way relationships become transactional, the way people use each other as mirrors for their own vanity. And he was right about that. But his solution was to withdraw, to seek a kind of purity that can only exist in isolation. And what he discovered, too late, is that purity might not be worth it. Think about the times you've pulled away from people. Maybe they disappointed you. Maybe you disappointed yourself in their presence. Maybe you just got tired of performing, of managing their expectations, of being less than you wanted to be. And there's relief in that distance, isn't there? A kind of peace in not having to explain yourself, in not having to compromise or negotiate or forgive. But there's also something else, a creeping awareness that maybe you didn't just shed relationships. You shed the parts of yourself that only exist in connection. Because we're not just individuals who happen to interact. We're fundamentally relational beings. We become ourselves through others. And when you cut those threads in pursuit of some untarnished selfhood, you risk discovering there's no one left to become. Rousseau felt this acutely. You can see it in his later writings, this desperate oscillation between defiance and longing. He insists he's happy alone, that he's finally free from the tyranny of others' opinions. But then he writes these achingly beautiful passages about his memories, walks with friends, conversations in gardens, moments of simple human warmth. And you realize he's not describing the past. He's describing what he lost. The cruel irony is that his philosophy helped create the world that now isolates us. This idea that we contain some essential self that must be freed from social constraints. It's everywhere now. It's in every self-help book, every meditation app, every Instagram post about setting boundaries. And it's not wrong. We do need to protect ourselves from toxic relationships, from systems that exploit our need to belong. But Rousseau took it to its logical extreme and found only emptiness there. Because once you've rejected every relationship that requires compromise, once you've deemed everyone else too corrupted by society to be worth knowing, once you've convinced yourself that true authenticity can only exist in solitude, what then? You're free, yes. Free in the way a stone is free, complete, untouchable, and utterly alone. There's a story from his last summer. A young admirer came to visit him hoping to meet the great philosopher. Rousseau refused to see him, but watched from his window as the young man stood outside, waiting. And something in Rousseau broke. He later wrote that he regretted not opening the door, not sharing even a brief conversation. But by then, the young man was gone, and Rousseau was left with what he'd been left with so many times, his principles intact and his heart empty. Maybe this is what he was trying to tell us all along, though he couldn't see it himself. That the choice isn't between corrupt society and pristine isolation. That real freedom isn't about escaping connection. It's about finding connections that don't require you to betray yourself. That being authentic doesn't mean being alone. It means being brave enough to be fully yourself in the presence of others. Even when it's messy, imperfect, when they disappoint you, and you disappoint them. The night is almost over now, and maybe you're lying there thinking about your own distances, the bridges you've burned, the people you've kept at arm's length, the ways you've protected yourself. That might also be ways you've imprisoned yourself. Rousseau can't answer this for you. He never figured it out himself. But maybe that's the gift he gives us. Not a solution, but a warning. That in running from the chains of society, you might forge chains of your own making. That the freedom you're chasing might be just another word for the loneliness you'll die in, and that the deepest courage isn't leaving the world behind. It's staying in it, messy and compromised as it is, and daring to be known anyway. Seventh exploration. Why do we call it progress? When everything natural dies, there's a moment that comes to every man, usually in the middle of the night, when he realizes he's been running a race he never agreed to enter. The career, the status, the careful performance of success. And somewhere in that darkness, a question surfaces like something ancient breaking through ice. When did I agree to this? Jean-Jacques Rousseau asked that question in 1750, and it destroyed him. Not physically, though it would eventually, but something deeper. It shattered the careful fiction he'd been living, the one we all live, that the world as we find it is the world as it should be. That civilization, with all its grand achievements and glittering promises, represents humanity's ascent rather than its fall. He was walking to Vincennes to visit a friend in prison. The afternoon was warm, the road dusty. In his pocket, a newspaper. In the newspaper, an essay contest. Has the progress of the sciences and arts contributed to the corruption or purification of morals? Most men would have written what was expected, a celebration of human achievement, a hymn to enlightenment. Rousseau read the question, and had what he later called a revelation so powerful it left him weeping beneath a tree, his shirt soaked with tears he didn't remember shedding, because he saw it, the whole terrible architecture of it. Every step toward what we call civilization was a step away from something we'd lost the language to name. Not some primitive paradise. Rousseau was too thoughtful for that romantic delusion. But a kind of wholeness, a state where a man's desires matched his needs, where his worth wasn't determined by the gaze of others, where he could sit with himself without the constant, gnawing feeling that he should be more, different, better, elsewhere. The sciences and arts hadn't freed humanity. They'd created new chains, invisible ones, the kind you don't feel until you try to move in a direction society hasn't approved. Think about the moment you learned to perform, not on a stage necessarily, but in life. When you discovered that the way you naturally were wasn't quite right, that your authentic response to things needed editing, that spontaneous joy, or honest anger, or simple contentment weren't appropriate in polite company. You learned to measure your words, to craft your image, to become, in Rousseau's language, an actor in the theater of social life. That learning, that's what he meant by corruption. Not moral decay in the religious sense, but a splitting, a division of the self into what you are and what you show, the creation of a performance so convincing, you sometimes forget there's a performer underneath. And the reward for this performance? Progress, comfort, the marvels of civilized life, art and literature and philosophy and all the sophisticated pleasures that separate us from beasts. But Rousseau stood at the edge of that glittering city and asked the question no one wanted to hear. What did we pay? He looked at the farmers leaving their land for factories, the artisans whose crafts were becoming obsolete, the scholars who wrote not to discover truth, but to win favor, the entire machinery of social ambition that turned human beings into instruments for someone else's profit. And he saw that what we called advancement was also a kind of forgetting. We'd forgotten how to be sufficient unto ourselves, how to find satisfaction in simple things, how to live without the constant need for validation from a world that had infinite demands and no loyalty. The woods outside Paris still existed then. Dark forests where you could walk for days and see no one. Rousseau would go there, alone, and feel something like peace. Not because nature was morally superior, he never made that mistake, but because in the forest there was no one to perform for, no hierarchy to climb, no invisible metrics of worth, just the body moving through space, the mind following its own strange paths, the self briefly whole again. But you can't live in the forest. That was the tragedy he understood. There's no going back to some imagined state of nature. The social contract is already signed. We're born into it, shaped by it, made by it. The language you think in, the desires you feel, the very structure of your consciousness, it's all marbled through with society's influence. So what does a man do with this knowledge? When he sees that progress is real, but so is the loss. That civilization gives with one hand and takes with the other. That we've built a world of wonders and imprisoned ourselves inside it? Rousseau's answer was strange and difficult, not withdrawal, not some naive return to primitive life, but a kind of double consciousness to live in society while seeing through it, to participate in the necessary fictions while knowing they're fictions, to maintain somehow some protected inner space, untouched by the outside world's demands. In the darkness of his small apartment, writing by candlelight, he was trying to remember something for us, something about what it means to be human that gets lost in the noise of becoming civilized. The capacity for genuine feeling, for authentic relationship, for a kind of freedom that has nothing to do with political rights and everything to do with the ability to meet yourself without shame. The world called him a madman for it, called him a traitor to enlightenment. But in the quiet hours when the performance is done and you're alone with yourself, you might hear what he heard. A question, soft as breathing. What parts of you died so you could fit in here? But there's something else Rousseau discovered. Something darker. Something that made the philosophers of his age turn away. Eighth exploration. What happens to your soul? When you learn, you're always being watched. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living under scrutiny, not the dramatic kind, not the surveillance state or the prison guard's gaze. Something subtler. The low hum of awareness that you're always, in some way, performing for an audience. That your worth is being calculated by eyes you can't see. That every choice, every word, every gesture is being measured against standards you didn't set and can't quite reach. Rousseau called it amour-propre. Self-love, but the corrupted kind. The kind that depends entirely on comparison, on being better than, on winning the endless status game that civilization creates and then pretends is natural. It starts innocently enough. A child wants his parents' approval, natural, human. But then it spreads, the approval of teachers, of peers, of strangers, until you're no longer living from the inside out. You stop feeling what you feel, wanting what you want. Instead, you live from the outside in, shaping yourself to meet the expectations of a social world that has opinions about everything you are. This was Rousseau's true insight into corruption. Not that society makes men evil, but that it makes them dependent. Dependent on reputation, on status, on the fragile, ever-shifting judgment of others. You become trapped in what he called opinion, that invisible web of social assessment that determines your value in every interaction. Watch a man at a dinner party. Not what he's saying, but the calculation behind it. The quick scan of the room to see who's listening. The adjustment of tone and topic based on who's present. The way a joke lands differently depending on who laughs. He's not being himself. He's being the version of himself that this particular audience requires. And he's doing it so smoothly, so automatically, he might not even notice. This is what Rousseau meant when he talked about the corruption of the sciences and arts. Not that knowledge is bad, but that it becomes another arena for status competition. You don't pursue truth for its own sake. You pursue recognition, publication, citation, the approval of your intellectual peers. The work itself, the thing that might have mattered, becomes secondary to your position in the hierarchy of scholars. He saw it everywhere, in the salons of Paris, where brilliant minds competed for the attention of wealthy patrons. In the theaters, where playwrights crafted their works not from genuine feeling, but from careful calculation of public taste. In his own heart, where the desire to be recognized as important warred with the desire to simply tell the truth. And the most insidious part? You can't opt out. Not really. Because society has arranged itself so that survival depends on playing the game. You need the good opinion of others to work, to love, to exist in public space without constant friction. The person who refuses to perform, who insists on complete authenticity, becomes unemployable, unlovable, impossible. Rousseau tried anyway. He wrote his Confessions, an act of radical honesty that scandalized Europe. He laid bare his shames, his failures, his darkest moments. Not because he enjoyed exposure, but because he was trying to break through the performance. To stand naked before the world and say, "This is what a human being actually is beneath all the polite lies." The world did not thank him for it. But in the writing of it, in those long nights of remembering and recording, he discovered something. That the self exists in layers. There's the performed self, the one you show the world. The adapted self, the one you've become through years of social conditioning. And somewhere underneath, sometimes barely audible, the original self. The one that existed before you learned to be ashamed of your natural reactions. That deepest self doesn't care about status, doesn't measure itself against others. It wants simple things: to eat when hungry, to rest when tired, to love without calculation, to create without audience, to exist without having to justify its existence. But we bury it. We have to function in civilization. The social world demands it. So we learn to ignore that voice, to override it, to replace its simple knowing with the complex mathematics of social acceptability. And something dies in that burial. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually over years, you lose touch with your own genuine responses. You're no longer sure what you actually think about things, separate from what you're supposed to think. Your desires become suspect. Are they really yours? Or just the desires society has taught you to have? Rousseau spent his later years in poverty, paranoid, alienated from the intellectual world that had once celebrated him. The history books call it madness. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was what happens when a man refuses to stop performing, and society refuses to let him rest. The constant vigilance required to maintain authenticity in a world built on pretense. It grinds you down. But there were moments, he wrote, walking alone at dawn, lying in a boat on a quiet lake, times when the weight of others' judgment lifted, when he could simply be, without the burden of being someone. And in those moments, he remembered what it felt like to be whole. not happy necessarily, not successful, just whole. The tragedy is that we can't live in those moments. We have to return to society, to the eyes, the judgments, the endless negotiations of social existence. But maybe knowing what we've lost is its own kind of freedom. The freedom to see clearly, to understand the price we're paying, to hold some small part of ourselves in reserve, untouched by the marketplace of status and opinion. In the dark, when there's no one watching, you might feel it. That oldest part of you, the one that doesn't need to prove anything, that knows its own worth without reference to comparison. It's still there, beneath everything you've learned to be, quiet, patient, waiting for moments when the performance can finally stop. And yet, there's one more thing Rousseau understood, something darker, something that we're only beginning to see. Ninth, exploration. Does the mirror you hold up to yourself belong to you or to them? There's a particular quality of silence that settles over a man when he finally stops trying to justify himself. Not the silence of defeat, something else. A kind of radical acceptance that he will never satisfy the world's demands, because the world's demands are infinite by design. Rousseau reached this silence late in life, after years of controversy, after friendships destroyed, after being driven from city to city, his books burned, his ideas condemned by church and state alike. He stopped defending himself, stopped explaining, just lived, as quietly as the world would let him, and wrote not for audiences, but for something else. For truth, maybe, or just for the pure act of seeing clearly and recording what he saw. This is where his philosophy becomes most personal, most dangerous, because he's asking you to consider something almost no one wants to face, that your own self-image, the story you tell yourself about who you are, might not be yours at all. You think of yourself as a certain kind of person, hardworking or principled or intelligent or kind. But where did these categories come from? Who taught you that these were the qualities worth having? And more importantly, are you actually these things? Or are you just performing them because the alternative would be admitting you're not? Rousseau wrote about walking through the streets of Paris and watching men who seemed to have lost something fundamental. Not their morals, in the traditional sense, but their center. They were like puppets, animated by society's strings, moving through roles they never questioned, wanting things because others wanted them, fearing judgment more than death. He called it alienation before Marx made the term famous. But Rousseau's version was more intimate, more psychological. He wasn't just talking about workers alienated from their labor. He meant something deeper, the alienation of the self from itself, the strange condition of being a stranger in your own skin, because you've spent so long being what others needed you to be. Think about the moment you recognize yourself in a mirror and feel surprised, not by aging, but by something else. A brief flash of, who is that? Because the face you present to the world, the person you've constructed so carefully, doesn't quite match the consciousness looking out through your eyes. There's a gap, a space between performer and performance that sometimes, in unguarded moments, becomes visible. That gap, that's where Rousseau lived, in that space between what he was and what the world demanded. And he discovered something there that most people spend their lives avoiding. You can choose not to close it. You can live in that tension, performing when you must, but knowing you're performing, maintaining some secret protected space that remains untouched by social pressure. It's not comfortable. God, it's not comfortable. Because once you see the performance, you can't unsee it. Every social interaction becomes slightly theatrical. You watch yourself playing roles: the professional, the friend, the lover, the citizen, and you're aware of the seams, the places where the constructed self doesn't quite fit the felt experience underneath. Most people, when they glimpse this, retreat. They double down on the performance, make it seamless, until they forget there's anything else. That's the safer choice, the more functional choice. You can live an entire life that way, successful and respected, never quite connecting with that deepest part of yourself that exists before and beneath all social construction. But Rousseau couldn't do it, or wouldn't. He kept probing that wound, kept asking, what would it mean to live from that deepest self? Not completely, that's impossible in society, but partially, to hold on to some thread of authentic being, even while navigating the necessary fictions of civilized life. His answer became what he called the general will. It sounds political, and it is, but it's also deeply personal. The idea that there's a true self, a genuine interest, that exists prior to and independent of social conditioning, and that a just society would be one that allowed that true self to flourish, rather than demanding its constant suppression. We haven't built that society. Maybe we can't. Maybe the price of civilization is always this alienation, this distance between what we are and what we show. But knowing that, really knowing it, changes something. You stop expecting society to fulfill you. Stop expecting your job or your status or your relationships to make you whole. Because wholeness, if it exists at all, exists in that protected space, the place no one else can see, the self that remains yours. In his final years, Rousseau took to copying music, just that. Sitting for hours with manuscript paper, carefully transcribing notes. Some historians think he was hiding from his paranoia. Maybe. Or maybe he'd found something. A task that required presence, but not performance. That engaged the hands and the mind without demanding social brilliance. Where he could be useful without being important. Where he could exist without having to prove he deserved to. There's a kind of peace in that, in lowering the stakes, in accepting that you'll never be enough for the world, because the world's appetite is infinite. But you might be enough for yourself, not the constructed self that will never be satisfied. The other one, the one that's been there all along, beneath the performance, waiting for you to remember it exists. The philosophers still argue about what Rousseau meant, whether he was coherent, whether his ideas could ever work in practice. But in the dark, in the quiet, those questions fade. What remains is simpler. A man who saw through the beautiful lies of civilization and couldn't stop telling the truth, even when it cost him everything, even when it left him alone. And maybe that's the final question. Not whether he was right, but whether you're willing to see what he saw, to stand in that gap between who you are and who you pretend to be, to know the price you're paying for admission to civilized life, and to decide consciously what parts of yourself you're willing to trade, and what parts, no matter what it costs, you'll keep. 10th exploration. When did you last speak a word that was truly yours? There's a particular kind of silence Rousseau knew well. Not the silence of an empty room or a winter field, but the silence that lives inside a man when he realizes he can no longer hear his own voice beneath the chorus of others. It's the silence that settles in slowly, like dust on furniture in a house where no one opens the windows anymore. He sat in those Parisian salons once, the ones where wit was currency and every sentence had to shine like polished silver, where philosophers gathered to be clever, to impress, to outthink each other in games that meant nothing and everything at once. And somewhere in those glittering rooms, surrounded by people who believed they were free because they could say whatever they pleased, Rousseau felt something close inside him, a door swinging shut, a key turning, because he noticed something the others didn't, or wouldn't, that every brilliant observation, every carefully constructed argument, every performance of wisdom was just that, a performance. The words weren't coming from some deep well of truth. They were echoes, reflections of reflections. Things said because they'd been said before, because they fit the shape of what was expected, because they earned approval from the right people in the right moment. And he began to wonder, when was the last time any of them had spoken something that was theirs alone, not borrowed, not rehearsed, not calculated for effect, just raw, real, and unmistakably their own? It's a strange thing to realize you've been speaking someone else's language your entire life, not French or English or any tongue you learned as a child, but something more subtle, the language of your time, your place, your people, the acceptable phrases, the proper opinions, the thoughts you're allowed to have and the ways you're permitted to express them. Rousseau called it the tyranny of opinion, but it wasn't kings or soldiers enforcing it. It was softer than that, more insidious. It was the gentle pressure of wanting to belong, to be admired, to avoid the terrible loneliness of standing apart. So you learn to think in shapes that fit. You pruned the wild branches of your thoughts until they grew in the direction everyone else's did. You became fluent in saying things that sounded like you, but came from everywhere else. He walked away from those salons eventually, walked away from Paris itself, went to live in simpler places where the pressure was less, where maybe, just maybe, he could hear himself think without the constant static of other voices telling him what thinking should sound like. But here's what he discovered in that quieter life. The voices followed him because they weren't out there. They were in here, woven so deeply into the fabric of who he'd become that he couldn't separate his own thoughts from theirs anymore. The opinions he'd absorbed, the judgments he'd internalized, the invisible audience he performed for, even when he was completely alone. You know this feeling, don't you? That moment when you're about to say something and you catch yourself editing it before it leaves your mouth. Not because it's untrue or unkind, but because some part of you is calculating how it will land, what it will reveal about you, whether it marks you as sophisticated or simple, enlightened or ignorant, one of us or one of them. And the tragedy isn't that we do this occasionally, it's that we do it constantly, endlessly, until we can't remember what we actually think about anything anymore, until our inner lives become focus groups, constantly polling invisible others to figure out what we're supposed to feel. Rousseau believed there was something underneath all that, something authentic and original that existed before we learned to perform ourselves, a voice that spoke in the language of the heart rather than the vocabulary of approval. But finding it required a kind of archaeological excavation, digging through layers of borrowed thoughts, adopted positions, and socially acceptable feelings to get to bedrock. Most men never make that journey. They live their entire lives in the upper strata, speaking fluently in voices that were never theirs, having opinions they inherited like furniture from previous tenants. And the saddest part? They don't even know they're doing it. They believe those borrowed thoughts are their own. They defend them passionately, never realizing they're just protecting someone else's words. There's a particular loneliness that comes with waking up to this. Because once you see it everywhere, in every conversation, every confident assertion, every heated debate where people are fighting for positions they didn't arrive at themselves, but adopted wholesale from their tribe, their time, their social station. And you start to wonder, what would it sound like if you spoke from that deeper place? The one beneath the performance, the one that exists before you calculate how you'll be received. Would anyone recognize you? Would you recognize yourself? Rousseau thought that reclaiming that authentic voice was the beginning of real freedom. Not the freedom to say whatever you want. That's easy. That's just noise. But the harder freedom of knowing what you actually want to say, of having something to express that comes from your own encounter with existence, not from the catalog of acceptable thoughts you've been given. It's a strange question to fall asleep on. This idea that maybe the most radical thing you could do isn't to speak louder or more often, but to fall silent long enough to hear what's underneath, to let all those borrowed voices quiet down until something else can emerge, something that sounds unfamiliar at first, because you've forgotten what your own voice sounds like without the echo chamber. When did you last speak a word that was truly yours? Not yesterday, not this morning, but ever. A word that came from that place beneath the performance, beneath the calculation, beneath the need to be understood or accepted or admired. Just a word that was real. That was you. That would have been exactly the same whether anyone heard it or not. It's worth wondering about, even if the answer is uncomfortable, especially if the answer is uncomfortable, because that discomfort might be the first honest thing you've felt in a very long time. 11th exploration. What became of the man who loved humanity but could not love a single human? There's something almost unbearably human about Jean-Jacques Rousseau's great contradiction. He spent his life writing about compassion, about the natural goodness in people, about building a society where everyone could flourish. And yet, the actual people in his life, flesh and blood, complicated, needy, real, he couldn't quite manage them. He ran from friendships, sabotaged relationships, left his 5 children at the doors of foundling hospitals where he knew most of them would probably die. People love to point to this as hypocrisy. Look at the philosopher who preached virtue but couldn't practice it. Look at the man who wrote about education while abandoning his own offspring. Look at the fraud. But maybe that's the wrong way to see it. Maybe Rousseau's tragedy wasn't hypocrisy at all, but something more painful, something that lives in the gap between the love we feel for ideas and the love we can actually give to the messy, difficult, disappointing people right in front of us. He really did love humanity. You can feel it in his writing, that aching tenderness for human potential, for what we could be if society didn't corrupt us, if we could return to something simpler, something more authentic. He looked at humanity in the abstract and saw something beautiful, worth defending, worth fighting for. But individual humans, they made demands, they needed things. They had expectations and feelings and complicated inner lives that couldn't be solved by theory. They didn't stay in the neat categories he built for them. They were petty sometimes, selfish, small. They disappointed him. And perhaps worse, they saw him. really saw him, saw past the brilliant philosopher to the anxious, paranoid, difficult man underneath. There's a kind of love that's easy from a distance. You can care deeply about the poor without having a homeless man sleep in your house. You can advocate passionately for justice without dealing with the tedious, grinding work of actually helping specific people with their specific problems. You can love children in theory while finding actual children exhausting and incomprehensible. Rousseau lived in that distance. He wrote treatises on how to raise children while his own were being raised by strangers, or not at all. He imagined perfect friendships in his novels, while his real friendships collapsed into accusations and paranoia. He dreamed of a social contract that would bind people together in mutual respect, while he couldn't maintain basic contracts with the people who knew him. And here's what haunts me about this. I don't think he was lying. I think he genuinely felt that love for humanity, that ache for human goodness and potential. It just couldn't survive contact with actual humans, their actual flaws, their needs, their demands. Maybe you recognize this in yourself. That feeling of caring deeply about big causes, broad principles, distant suffering, while finding the people in your immediate life somehow harder to love. Your neighbor's problems feel trivial compared to global injustice. Your family's needs feel suffocating compared to your important work in the world. The colleague who needs help feels like an interruption to your mission of helping humanity. There's something safer about loving humanity than loving humans. Humanity doesn't show up at your door needing something. Humanity doesn't question your motives or see through your defenses. Humanity doesn't require patience or forgiveness or showing up day after day for the boring, unglamorous work of actual relationship. Rousseau convinced himself his children would be better off without him, that the foundling hospitals would raise them more naturally than he could in his complicated, anxious, unstable life. Maybe he was right. Or maybe he was just better at constructing theories than facing the specific, undeniable guilt of looking into his own child's eyes. His friends saw this split in him. Diderot, who loved him once, eventually called him out, told him his love for humanity was really just hatred for his neighbors dressed up in philosophical clothing, that he preferred mankind in general because then he didn't have to deal with men in particular. It's a brutal observation, but there's truth in it, because loving humanity doesn't cost you much. It doesn't require sacrifice or compromise or seeing yourself clearly in the mirror of someone else's disappointment. It lets you feel virtuous without doing the hard, humbling work of actual love. Rousseau spent his later years alone, paranoid, convinced that everyone was plotting against him, writing confessions where he tried to explain himself, justify himself, make people understand. And maybe that loneliness was inevitable, because the distance he maintained, the one that let him love humanity while fleeing from humans, eventually became a chasm no one could cross. There's a warning in this for anyone who cares about ideas more than people, who loves causes more than the complicated individuals caught up in them, who finds it easier to have compassion for the abstract suffering of millions than patience for the specific annoying coworker or difficult family member right in front of them. Because real love, the kind that actually changes anything, happens in the particular, not the universal. It happens when you show up for someone who's boring or difficult or makes demands on your time. When you stay when it would be easier to leave. When you deal with the mess of actual relationship instead of retreating into beautiful theories about what relationship should be. Rousseau never learned this. Or maybe he learned it too late, in those lonely final years, when the gap between his dreams and his life became impossible to ignore. When all his beautiful ideas about human goodness couldn't comfort him, because he'd driven away every actual good human who tried to know him. What became of the man who loved humanity but couldn't love a single human? He died alone, brilliant and influential, and profoundly lonely. His ideas changed the world, his relationships left wreckage, and the question that hangs in the air isn't whether you agree with his philosophy. It's whether you recognize his pattern, whether you've ever chosen the comfort of abstract compassion over the difficulty of specific love, whether you've ever found it easier to care about everyone in general than someone in particular. It's uncomfortable territory, because we like to think our love for big ideals proves something about our character. But maybe it proves nothing at all. Maybe the only love that matters is the kind that costs you something, that requires you to show up. That happens in the messy, unglamorous reality of dealing with actual people in their actual specificity. Rousseau wrote that man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. But maybe his real chains were the ones he built himself, the distance he kept, the abstractions he hid behind, the gap between the love he felt and the love he could give. Those chains followed him everywhere, even to the end. 12th exploration. If nature made you whole, why does every law promise to complete you? There's a story Rousseau kept circling back to, though he never quite told it the same way twice. The story of what happened when humans stopped being animals and started being citizens. When we traded forests for cities, instinct for law, wildness for order. He called it the social contract, but really it was a kind of fall. Not from grace exactly, but from wholeness. Because in his imagining there was a time before property and jealousy and comparison, before anyone looked at their neighbor's land and wanted it, or looked at their neighbor's status and felt diminished by it. A time when a human was just a creature among creatures, complete in themselves, needing nothing they didn't have. Now, before you dismiss this as naive romanticism, understand. Rousseau didn't think that primitive life was perfect or easy. He knew it was hard, probably short, certainly lacking in comfort. But there was something about it he found profoundly important, an integrity, a coherence. The human animal was what it was, without apology or pretense or the gnawing sense that it should be something else. Then came society, and with it, something that looked like progress but felt like fracture. Because suddenly, you weren't enough just as you were. You needed property to prove your worth, education to demonstrate your value, status to earn respect. You needed law to tell you how to be good, religion to tell you how to be righteous, etiquette to tell you how to be proper. Every institution claimed to complete you, claimed you were lacking something essential that only it could provide. The church said you were born sinful and needed salvation. The state said you were born chaotic and needed order. Society said you were born nothing and needed to earn your personhood through achievement, acquisition, and endless performance. And here's the thing that haunted Rousseau. Maybe you believed them. Maybe you internalized this idea that you were fundamentally incomplete. That wholeness was always somewhere outside yourself. In the next accomplishment, the next possession, the next title or achievement or recognition. Watch how laws are sold to you. They're never just restrictions. They're promises. This law will make you safer. This regulation will make you happier. This rule will make you better. Submit to this authority, and you'll finally be the complete person you're meant to be. It's seductive because you do feel incomplete, don't you? There's always something missing, some gap between who you are and who you think you should be. Some sense that you're not quite enough, not quite whole, not quite arrived at the person you're supposed to be. But Rousseau wondered, what if that feeling isn't truth? What if it's not that you were born incomplete, but that you've been taught to feel incomplete? That the very civilization promising to complete you is the thing that fractured you in the first place. Think about it. When you're alone in nature, really alone, not Instagram alone, but actually solitary, there's a strange peace that can settle in. The endless performance stops. The comparison stops. All the shoulds and supposed tos fall away. And for a moment, just yourself, existing, is enough. But bring one other person into view and watch what happens. Immediately, you're measuring, comparing, wondering how you appear to them, adjusting yourself to fit their expectations, or deliberately defying them, which is just another form of the same game. The wholeness fractures. The performance begins. Rousseau believed this was the trade we made for civilization. We gained so much: art, science, comfort, connection. But we lost something too. That animal completeness. That sense of being sufficient unto yourself. We became dependent on each other's opinions, each other's approval, each other's validation. We became incomplete by design, so we'd need what society was selling. Every law carries this assumption. That left to your own devices, you'd be insufficient, dangerous, wrong, that you need external structure to make you right. And maybe some laws are practical necessities. Don't murder people, don't steal. Basic stuff that lets us coexist. But most laws go further. They encode a vision of what a proper person should be. And the implication is always that you're not that person yet. You need molding, correcting, completing. This is why Rousseau seemed crazy to his contemporaries. Because he looked at all the magnificent edifices of civilization, the governments, institutions, churches, universities, and instead of seeing progress, he saw a kind of elaborate cage. Beautiful bars, perhaps. Golden even, but bars nonetheless. And the cruelest part wasn't that they constrained you. It's that they made you believe you needed constraining. Made you believe that without them, you'd be nothing, less than nothing. That your natural self was something shameful, dangerous, or insufficient. That completion could only come from outside. You see this everywhere once you start looking. The education system that tells you you're ignorant until they fill you with knowledge. The economy that tells you you're worthless until you prove your productivity. The culture that tells you you're invisible until you achieve something remarkable. Every system promising to make you whole while subtly insisting you're currently broken. And maybe the most insidious part is how we police ourselves. We've internalized these laws so deeply that we don't need external enforcement anymore. We carry the judge inside, constantly measuring ourselves against standards we didn't create, for a completion that always remains just out of reach. Rousseau didn't have a solution exactly. He knew we couldn't go back to the forest, even if we wanted to. Civilization, for all its problems, was here to stay. But he thought maybe we could stop lying to ourselves about what we'd lost. Stop pretending that more laws, more structure, more external validation would finally make us complete. Because here's the thing about wholeness. It's not additive. You don't become whole by adding pieces. You become whole by remembering you never actually needed them in the first place. Somewhere beneath all the social conditioning, beneath all the laws and expectations and performances, there's still that animal self, the one that existed before anyone told you what you should be. It's not pure or perfect or necessarily good, but it's whole, it's complete, it's sufficient. The question is whether you can still hear it under all the noise, whether you can feel it beneath all the layers of should and supposed to, whether you can remember what it was like before you learned to need completion from anything outside yourself. If nature made you whole, why does every law promise to complete you? Maybe the answer is simpler than it seems. Maybe every promise of completion is really just a reminder that you've forgotten what you already are. And maybe the most radical act available to you isn't to find better laws, or better institutions, or better systems to complete you. Maybe it's to remember, just for a moment, what it feels like to not need completing at all, to just be sufficient, whole, enough, the way you were before anyone told you otherwise.